Hello, it's a real blessing for me to be here today. About 30 years ago, my mum was from Cork, my dad was from Sligo. About 30 years ago, my dad decided he was going to have the trip back to Sligo and the old country and see how things were going along. So we all came over together and we toured all around. And I remember coming to Galway and my nephew, who was just a toddler then, sitting on the bench next to Patrick O'Connor and having his photo taken. And, we had a lovely time. But we would never have thought that even with the battles that were going on then, 30 years later, I'll be walking across the same square in a post-abortive Ireland. My father spent most of his life writing to TDs in Ireland and MPs in England about abortion and asking them not to vote for abortion and not to liberalise abortion, as did many, many others. And I know there were many hours of prayer for that end, but yet here we are. So I really want to talk a little bit about my work and about how much prayer plays a part in it. Sorry, no one can ever hear me anyway, but yeah. So I came over to Ireland in about 1995 and was really interested in setting up something a bit like youth defence. So we wanted to do street sessions and some political campaigning and so on. But I came over in the hope of meeting up with some of the people from Youth Defence, and probably to their, great benefit, they were away when I came, so I never got to meet them. But I bumped into a man called Patrick O'Dwyer, who I think was one of the first people convicted for praying in Ireland and witnessing against some of these lovely things that the Irish government have wanted to bring in. And Patrick directed me to another couple, Eamon and Agatha Murphy, who had just recently started a crisis pregnancy centre here in Dublin, actually. And Eamon had gotten the idea from some work he had seen in America, in a centre in Chicago, and I later on came to find out that there were centres like this all over Europe that had started up offering help to really abortion-minded women. And I can tell you that you don't have to be, a great person. You can be an extremely lazy person, and still God can work through you if you just have faith and let him do what he wants to do, because I'm all those things, and yet I can say that the work that we do has saved over 4,000 lives since 1997. So Eamon recruited me to start a centre. So in honesty, he is the founder of the Good Counsel Network, because he put me over a barrel and got me to found it. So when I say I'm the founder, that's kind of a bit of a fiction, really. But something I've noticed from the beginning is that the girls who you think are most likely to not keep their baby, the hardest cases you see, the women who seem least likely to listen, unwilling to take your help, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can help them, because abortion is all about despair. Even the most liberated, independent woman doesn't really, at the bottom of it, want to kill her children. And if she's killing her children, it's often because she and others around her have been foisted the belief that somehow having the baby, when maybe the father doesn't want the baby, or the family aren't happy about the baby, or whatever it is, that this will somehow liberate her, and that the child is somehow better off not being born. So we have to have the faith that these women don't have, because abortion is all about despair, lack of faith, losing hope. And if we don't have faith for them, then nobody has the faith to keep these children. I've noticed in England, I always hate it when people come from somewhere else and tell us what we should be doing. But what I can tell you, because England's in a terrible state, so I can't stand here and tell you what you should be doing, but I can certainly tell you what you shouldn't be doing, because we've been doing it for nearly 60 years now, and we've really learned what doesn't work. So the first thing I would say is everyone thinks everyone else's work should be rooted in prayer, but not their own. That is to say, not that they think people shouldn't pray. We all think we should be praying privately, but for instance, the parliamentary groups say, well, we can't bring prayer into it, we must be secular publicly. And the counselling groups say, well, we must be secular publicly, but you could be more prayerful in public. But the fact of the matter is, there are non-Catholics involved in the pro-life movement. We have some. There are atheists involved in the pro-life movement. We have some. But, when God calls Catholics to the pro-life movement, they should be who they are. It's not like all these secular institutes or government don't think we're Catholics anyway. They all know we're Catholic. So we should just be who we are, and we should pray privately and publicly and together and everywhere, all the time. Everyone thinks private prayer is enough, but it is not enough, because it's a public sin, abortion is. It's a public scourge on our country. And when our countries pass these laws publicly, we have to publicly reclaim these countries for God. Even those who do pray or fast don't always take it seriously enough. I can stand here and say this because I am the prime person who doesn't take it seriously enough. We also need to have faith in our Lord to grant our prayers. If we don't have that faith, then our prayers are kind of empty words. In our work, we often have to depend on prayer completely to stay open ourselves, for our centre just to keep going, to change hearts and minds of the women we see, to meet their needs for housing and financial help and so on. Every day is a battle, and that keeps us on our knees, which is a blessing actually, because we wouldn't bother otherwise. We are blessed to have Mass in our centre pretty much daily, and adoration of the Blessed Sacrament pretty much daily also. You don't just walk up to your bishop and get that permission, by the way. You have to keep praying and asking and praying and asking and being polite and praying and asking. So that's another thing. We mustn't give up on the church when it doesn't automatically help us with the things we want. We have to Christianize the church, and the church has to re-Christianize us as well. You know, we have to keep witnessing to each other. Saying the Rosary in adoration has become a way of life for most of our staff and volunteers, and indeed a way of survival, because without it we'd all go mad. Prayer reaches women we cannot reach. We had one lady, I'm going to call her Belinda, who'd had 5 previous abortions, and her boyfriend, together with her, had walked into another pregnancy that they couldn't keep. And he came outside the clinic after dropping her off, very upset, but not knowing what else they could do. Came over to our staff and volunteers and prayed the Divine Mercy Chaplet with us for about 10 minutes until the woman walked out of the clinic and said, oh, they can't do it today, and ended up keeping her baby. Prayer changes hearts when we cannot change hearts. I remember in particular one lady I saw, I'll call her Elaine, who insisted very strongly throughout the counselling session with her, I only want 2 children, I've only ever wanted 2 children. Nothing you say will change my mind. That day, the Westminster Diocese had brought the missionary image of Our Lady of Guadalupe to Westminster Cathedral, and they were having a prayer service at 3 o'clock. At 3 o'clock, everything changed in the counselling room. This woman burst into tears. She suddenly said, I've been lying to you. I've always wanted more children. She went away at the end of that counselling session saying, I can't wait to have that smell of a new baby in my home. It was just instantaneous change when the prayer in the cathedral for life began. Another lady, Elizabeth, was sent to us last year by her parish priest. Her marriage was breaking down when she found out that she was pregnant with baby number 5. When he heard that she was planning to abort her baby, her parish priest started a 9-day fast. By the time he referred her to us, she was completely open to accepting help to keep her baby. Soon afterwards, she and her husband resolved their marriage problems. At times, we have mothers who cannot be easily helped by any human means. Their problem is not one that can be solved with money, moral support, or practical help. Instead, it might be the brokenness of an abusive family background, or an abusive relationship, or of many previous abortions. One woman I saw recently told me between her mother and her sisters, she'd had 17 abortions in the family. Sometimes only prayer can help. When we reach out to our prayer chains online and by phone and however we can reach them, we see an immediate change begin. With some women, as soon as the prayers begin to decline, their desire for abortion begins again. Some demons can only be cast out by prayer and fasting. In the battle against abortion, we do need the church leading us. This is one of the reasons why the pro-life movement ends up squabbling amongst itself. The sheep need the shepherd, or they will scatter. In England, when we had the first buffer zone case, so that was when they brought in the law, meaning that there's a 150-metre buffer zone around the abortion centres where we can't speak to women or offer leaflets, the whole pro-life movement came together to work to get these women who had received help from these vigils on the TV and interviewed. Many groups refused to send their own speakers on to be interviewed to make sure that these women got picked instead, because news channels did not want to interview these women, but in the end they were forced to. This was the beginning of a little group of pro-life leaders who in 2019 met in Walsingham, the National Shrine of Our Lady, to jointly consecrate the whole pro-life movement to her. We also resolved not to publicly criticise one another and to work together to resolve issues. This does not mean we don't have issues or disagreements, but I think it has substantially helped us not to keep tripping each other up and being obstacles to each other's work. We have faced many things worsening since then in the UK. Pills by post abortions, at a time when the abortion centres were the busiest. I mean, during COVID, the abortion centres were bursting at the seams. They were having so many women coming in. But the government allowed pills by post on the grounds that these women couldn't go in for their abortions, which was not true. The abortion numbers jumped by 50,000 that year. Then the extension of abortion to Northern Ireland, and now the threat of total decriminalisation and also of legalised euthanasia. However, the Church has spoken up on euthanasia much more strongly than it has spoken out against anything for years, which I also think is a fruit of prayer. We must draw the bishops out to support us. A late great Jesuit, Father Thwaites, who was based in London, used to say, "In all the trials of history, it is the laity who have brought priests and bishops out to defend, support the teachings of the Church." We can only do this by peaceful, prayerful, faithful approach to the bishops, respectful of the order Christ put in the Church hierarchy, but respectfully insistent. Public rosaries, public adoration, fasting, private prayer, daily mass. We already know these are the weapons, but we don't use them enough. And real faith. We've had many successes through prayer, even though the tide of abortion is still going the wrong way. There have been many little triumphs which have delayed abortion laws or extension of laws or the incoming buffer zones. I think Robert, who's here, could speak about Bedford Square Abortion Centre. We had a woman who was running a vigil at Bedford Square for 10 years. She was travelling down from Cambridge every Saturday, running a prayer vigil there. And at one point we had a 9-day novena of prayer, finishing with a mass in thanksgiving for the abortion centre closing. And the girl said to us, "Well, the abortion centre isn't closed though." So we said, I think Stuart, my husband Stuart, said, "But it's going to close and we're thanking God for it now." Well, some 10 years later, when the first 40 Days for Life campaigns were held there, the abortion centre did come to close. And Robert managed to get permission to have mass inside the abortion centre after it had closed. And who should turn up to say the mass but the same priest who had said the mass 10 years earlier in Thanksgiving for the closing of the clinic. On top of that, the date that the mass was held was the feast of Our Lady of Good Counsel, who is our patroness. So we saw God's hand all over that. We had another abortion centre which closed down for a year, a few years back. We were praying to GK Chesterton for the closure of this clinic. And one day one of our supporters was outside praying with a little badge of Frances Chesterton, GK Chesterton's wife. And Chesterton's estate agents came over to tell this man that he was photographing the clinic and it was going up for sale. Now, it never was sold and it did reopen. But that was 1 year where that abortion centre was not performing abortions. In another case, we went to Lambeth Council when they were preparing to bring in a buffer zone. Great London pro-lifer Sean Norton is from that area. There were 2 abortion centres in that area that would have had buffer zones around them as far back as 2018. But at this meeting, we were waiting for it to get started and Sean stood up and said, "Well, let's start with an Our Father and a Hail Mary." So we did while the council were kind of getting their papers together for the meeting. There was, as they sometimes like to do, they split us all into groups so we could vote on the different rules they were going to bring in. This was them consulting with the pro-life movement on a already decided buffer zone that was coming in. But in each of the 6 groups that they split us into, there was a priest or a deacon, because so many of the local clergy had turned out to support us. Well, that meeting fell to pieces and the council were unable to bring in that buffer zone, and in fact there wasn't a buffer zone at those 2 abortion centres until last year when the national abortion buffer zone came in. that may not seem like a great triumph, but it was several years, nearly 6 years, where we had no buffer zone there, and there have been hundreds of turnarounds in that time who would not have received that help. So I feel that if we prayed more, these temporary victories would become permanent victories. And lastly, several years back when they were first trying to bring in the buffer zone, because that started in about 2014, we had the Rosary on the coast, and at 3 o'clock on the day of the Rosary on the coast, Father Jeremy Davis, the exorcist of the Westminster Diocese, stood on the coast at the end of the Rosary and turned round to England and performed an exorcism of the whole country. At 3 o'clock, the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, resigned at that very moment when he was performing that exorcism. Sajid Javid was the new Home Secretary, who was much more open on the question of buffer zones, and that again delayed buffer zones until last year. So we've had many temporary triumphs that have really held back the tide of liberalising abortion. Even this latest law that's been proposed hasn't come in yet. We still have time to pray and act and bring the church to the street to witness against it. Countries like Poland and El Salvador have actually turned back abortion laws with prayer, even though things are now going the wrong way in Poland. We have seen that, for many years Poland was abortion-free almost because of prayer and witness of the church and individuals. Prayer buys time and saves lives, and more prayer will save more lives. We have to be prepared to saturate our own lives and the pro-life movement as a whole in prayer if we want to be what God wants us to be. Thank you.